Welcome to the Estonian General Intelligence podcast. And I'm feeling actually quite proud that this moment has arrived. And I'm very grateful to the first guest, the inaugural guest of the podcast, Luukas Ilves.
Well, I'm humbly honored to be here. Thank you.
And thank you. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. And hopefully we'll be able to cover topics on governance, digital governance, the interesting topics of AI and AGI, and how they're affecting all of us in societies and organizations, and many, many other things.
I don't doubt it'll be fun for us. I hope we maintain some strict structure for the poor listeners, too.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to get started, rather than going into a very long introduction, I will be having your introduction actually listed with the podcast, but I would love to hear a bit of a background for the listener, and also if you could point out some of the key inflection points and kind of aha moments that have really impacted your thinking on the governance, digital governance, AI, all those topics, and where you are today.
Let's see how deep we go. Let me start sort of before I really started thinking about anything tech. My academic background is in social sciences, economics, history, some philosophy, and I grew up more in the US, although I'm Estonian than in Estonia. And I did my undergraduate thesis on Estonia's reforms in the 80s and the 90s, and sort of decided after that, well, I'm going to come back to Estonia, do my military service here, and then stay as long as it's interesting. And 15 years later, I'm still here. But what happened was, like many people with a social sciences and humanities background who didn't know what to do with their lives, I went and worked for the government in the policy planning department of the Defense Ministry. That's my first job after my military service. And my colleague who was responsible for cyber policy in 2010 went on maternity leave. And then being the youngest, I got told, well, you take over the cyber policy. And so that's sort of how I got in a broader sense to tech policy. And since then, I've done various things with the Estonian government. I was in Brussels where I did various things, but primarily I negotiated EU law on behalf of Estonia. And then worked for a while at a deep tech here in Estonia called wartime. And a few years ago, applied for and surprisingly was given, every civil service job in Estonia is an open public application for the government CIO job, the sort of undersecretary for digital transformation. And that made me responsible for digital infrastructure, digital government, and cybersecurity. And then last year I ran unsuccessfully for European Parliament, which maybe from a quality of life perspective wasn't so bad. I don't have to fly to Brussels and and Strasbourg once in every week. And now I have the privilege of working with my colleagues in Ukraine. I really started working with them very closely in 2022 when Russia's full-scale invasion happened. There's a lot we did in the first days and weeks of the war to sort of keep Ukrainian digital government going, and we developed a very close working relationship between Estonia and Ukraine on a whole bunch of different fronts. And so now I have the privilege of advising them, and I'd say that some of what Ukraine's doing is not just cutting edge, but even beyond what Estonia is doing, which is sort of, for better or for worse, inevitable when you find yourself in those circumstances and you have to innovate.
Most excellent. Quite an interesting background for quite a young age, I would even still say.
Well, this is Estonia, right?
Yes.
I mean, it's not considered young in Estonia. We've had how many prime ministers in their 1930s? So you should say I'm failing. I only made it to undersecretary. I didn't get to prime minister. I also haven't started any unicorns yet because we've got our fair share of unicorn founders in the 30s. So I feel like I'm kind of average for Estonia.
That's a true point. But still, given your background and to kind of frame the conversation for today, as we'll be covering many different topics, we'll be covering the topic of governance itself. We'll be talking about digital governance. We'll be talking about AI, AGI, all the different aspects, what are the best ways to implement different technological solutions, how to impact societal change and everything like this. I think to frame this conversation, one important aspect is also the perspectives. And my experience, having lived in the United States as well, having lived in Ukraine, now just spent 2.5 years in Africa, working on digitalization topics and all of this, I'm seeing very different perspectives on how people view what is governance, what is digital governance. Maybe you could give the listener a short overview of how do you see that, how, for example, Americans are thinking about the governance, digital governance, how the Brussels view is, what the Estonian view is, and now also what the Ukrainian view.
Yeah, geez. I mean, I think we could do a whole podcast series on that, right? We're not going to recount the constitutional history of all these countries, but look, I think maybe it's interesting to start with this question of how government and digital technology have intersected. Because, of course, we like to pretend this is all new and cutting edge, but the computer is an invention of the 1940s, the internet's a phenomenon of the 1970s, and governance has been interacting with technology from that, I mean, with digital technology since then. And of course, the prehistory, you could say that the 19th century state and the Industrial Revolution were also about information processing, but let's not go that far. So let me start with an anecdote. When I was government CIO, I got an invitation to the 60th birthday party of Brazil's Agency for Digital Government. This is maybe in 2021 or 22. So let's just pause for a moment. Brazil had an agency of digital government founded in the 1960s. And what was going on in the 1960s? Well, in the 1950s, all of corporate America started adopting mainframes for everything from airline bookings to any back office process you can imagine. And of course, also the public sector in the US was doing this. I'm sure the IRS had mainframes in the 1950s. And so the Brazilians, being in the broader US economic orbit, said, well, we should do this too. And so rationally, they think, okay, for the government part of this, we need an agency. And so Brazil started having digital government in the 60s, and this would have been true for most of, the sort of the developed, or shall we say, the capitalist world. And while there was some information processing and so on, and some tech that happened in this building here in Taltech in the Soviet Union, a lot less. And so Estonia, when it, in 1991, regained its independence, started rebuilding its society, happened to have interesting timing. And as we know in tech, timing is everything. We were, as Estonians, rebuilding our entire country, the laws, the institutions, at a time when the world was going through a massive technological transformation. Because what had been the preserve of organizations, computing in the 1960s and 70s and even the 80s, was really for the few. It was for universities, for companies. The unit of compute was the organization. There was tinkering in the 80s, but generally it was organizational. And suddenly in the 90s, the PC becomes universal. The internet, which has been around since the 70s, becomes a World Wide Web, and it becomes something that a consumer would have at home. And so when Estonians are asking in the 90s, what is the technological substrate to how our administration is going to process various things, do the work of the administration, that substrate is the personal computer and the World Wide Web. And so then naturally, that means we have to have a digital identity so we can connect to individuals that we're talking to. And we have to have a portal that everyone can access online. And so what that leads to is that for Estonians, the sort of tech in government is just sort of, there's a set of assumptions that we make that we could make because we're starting in the 90s. Now, I want to step back for a moment because, of course, the project in 1990 wasn't just to rebuild the state and the functioning of government. It was to rebuild society and the economy as a whole. The Estonian national trauma is that in 1939, we had about 120% of the GDP per capita of Finland. And in 1991, we had 10% of the GDP per capita of Finland. And so there was this realization in the early 90s that the one place where we were more or less at an even starting line with the rest of the developed. And so for Estonians, of course, this idea that technology is a force multiplier for a country that was at the time fairly poor and is then and is still today very small, that became baked into the woodwork in a basic positive assumption. And if we compare that to the US, I mean, first of all, there's a broader story of technology and US enterprise. It's very clear that the internet is, as a concrete technology, the digital revolution, Silicon Valley, Stanford, even though America likes to lionize the private sector, I mean, these were born out of the defense industrial base in the Cold War. So there is that stronger connection of how the US thinks about the state as a provider of security and how that's led to incredible technological innovation. But for a whole host of reasons, that doesn't cycle back into government as a whole, into how the US provides public goods, how the work of administration sort of does its work. And so we've had this bizarre phenomenon, this sort of, you have a situation where in Silicon Valley where you have the cradle of all of these companies, you still have to go and apply for for a driver's license, standing in line at the DMV, fax in paperwork to the school system, and so on. But that's not a function of underlying technological capability or factor endowment. That's a function of how administration works. And so I think it's really important when we look at digital government and who is good at the use of technology in public administration, like there's a very poor correlation between that and the general technological capability of a society. I mean, by the same token, Sweden, one of the most advanced digital economies, incredible hotbed of innovation and talent, compared to a lot of other countries in Europe, has a lot of work to do in public sector technology use. UK has found itself in a similar situation. And even France and Germany, if we look at adoption of the internet, the broader consumer environment, they've actually moved much faster than the administration has. And then we see countries that may not be, in terms of their overall infrastructure or factor endowment, the most advanced, with public administrations that have been very, very capable and where that development of public administration leads things. I mean, so if you look within Europe at the countries that are really good at digital government, there's some unusual suspects. I mean, Estonia historically would have been an unusual suspect. Portugal, incredibly capable, thinks about EID and data interoperability the way we do. We look across the world, we see unexpected surprises everywhere, where it's it's not a function of is a country good at tech, but has the public sector figured out that tech enables our business, our mission, our purpose in certain ways, and are we then willing to make the adjustments to how our organization works, how we do things, what our processes are to take advantage of that.
Excellent. And maybe also to bring in the Ukrainian perspective,
yes,
because I think that they are the ones that are feeling the real practical benefit of having the digital government, having very resilient, very impactful, and an immediate governance.
Yeah. So, I mean, Ukraine, of course, interesting. Ukraine. Before we talk about digital, let's talk about governance, right? I mean, you can view 1991 as a natural experiment of sorts, in the sense that you had 15 within the Soviet Union, 20 odd. We look more broadly at the Warsaw Pact area countries that more or less emerged from a similar governance construct and a similar level of poverty at the same time, and then huge divergence in outcomes. And so historically, from 1991 to sometime in the last decade, Ukraine didn't do very well. And all of the institutional efforts that Estonia, but also Latvia, Lithuania, Czech Republic, Poland, and so on made to become part of the EU, NATO, etc., Ukraine didn't pull off, and had a lot of the governance problems that come with that. And then they had this moment in 2014 with the Euromaidan, where really they collectively said, that's it. Now we're going to make a choice. And of course, in the background, you have an incredible amount of technological talent, both physically in Ukraine and also Ukrainians across the world. So there's never a question of, can Ukrainians do good things with technology? Now, what's happened, we're going to get to Ukraine at war, but the prehistory is that a little bit before the Euromaidan, but really with a in earnest from 2014, public administration, Ukraine started dealing with technology. So the famous thing 2014 to 19 was ProZorro, world's most transparent system for procurements. And really today, Ukraine has the most transparent public procurements in the world. The other thing is that from around that time, a lot of Estonians started being in Ukraine. So the e-governance academy set up an office there. Various Estonians, both in government outside, started working with Ukraine to say, well, how can we do broader institutional reforms? And how can we support those with technology? And then 2019 happens. President Zelensky, who is a populist, right? I mean, we should remind ourselves in 2019 that the rest of the world looked at him and didn't necessarily see a savior for Western values. In fact, there was this question of would he be more Russia-friendly than some of his predecessors. But really, President Zelensky's campaign was about building a big grassroots movement around truly fixing governance in Ukraine. And part of that was tech. And it started off just being a question of tech and corruption and making the state more transparent. But Zelensky, at the time, candidate Zelensky, brought onto his team a young, at the time, 28-year-old fellow, Mikhailo Fedorov, who ran a social media marketing agency, a very good one, in Kyiv, who said, look, let's talk about tech more broadly. And they came up with this metaphor, brilliant metaphor, truly amazing political communication. Let's put the state in a smartphone. And that was literally about let's make the digital services be mobile friendly. But it also had this encapsulated this broader metaphor of, well, how can we provide people the transparency, the convenience, the control that they experience with tech apps with regards to their relationship to the state in a country where the relationship between citizen and state has always been fraught. And they were elected with that agenda. And so then they came, both President Zelensky and Vice Prime Minister Fedorov came to Estonia in late 2019. The president said to Fedorov, okay, copy the Estonians, do what they did. And that's not unique. Other countries come and do that, but Ukraine actually did that in earnest. So they very consciously put in place a reform program with a lot of copying of tech. So Trembita, the Ukrainian interoperability solution, is based on X-Roads, done by Cybernetica, a company here in Estonia. Down the road, actually, a lot of the reforms of individual sectors, the legislation was patterned on Estonian. And what Ukrainians say based on this is they saved several years of time. They just moved faster. And so in 2021, they launched, or end of 2020, they launched DIA, the Ukrainian sort of mobile app. And at that moment, within the space of what DIA covered, you can say that Ukraine had already overtaken Estonia because Estonia didn't have an app. And they did all the things in building that app that anyone in building an app in 2020, 2021 would do to build a user-friendly, well-designed app. But they also had that marketing genius of a digital minister who had previously been in charge of a marketing agency. So before they built the app, they made a brand and they user tested the brand. And then they really thought through the way that only a commercial company can. Well, what do we do to create user uptake? So what was happening in 2021? Corona. So they said, Ukraine, like everyone else, was working on a digital COVID pass. They said the only way we can get the COVID pass digitally is to download it to the app. So suddenly they get everyone downloading the app. And you have this miracle where the day before the war starts, more than half of the adult population is this app that was launched a year before. And so they do, I mean, the app is a sort of visible thing. They do a lot of transformation of services. They build an incredibly agile team from 2019 to 2021. And then the war happens. And of course, this is an unforeseen circumstance. You know, it's like it's going to put to the test everything they've done. And the miracle that emerges is that in the 2-3 years that they'd been doing this work, they really built the firmament for doing something no country had ever done, which is, first of all, in the context of a full-scale war, being invaded by Russia, continuing operation of a lot of essential and civilian services, and then pushing out new services really in days and weeks. So the first couple of weeks in February, March, they wrote an error rate alert app, pushed it out to everyone. They added a channel to Telegram where authenticated users, so with the Ukrainian EID, could notify the army of troop movements so they could get crowdsource information on where the Russians were moving around. They started doing things like having an application process for people who are displaced persons to get support funds. And while that's all going on, first of all, the Russian attempts to destroy physically the digital state, they fail. They move everything very quickly to cloud. And they then make a hard pivot of the entire Ukrainian tech community. This isn't just the Ukrainians in Ukraine, but more broadly Ukrainians across the world into the war effort. And we'll get to that in a moment, but I want to say I think that hard pivot is possible because of the work they've done in the couple previous years. Because I think Ukrainians historically have been quite cynical about government in Ukraine. I mean, President Zelensky's TV show, if you watch, it's the best example of that. But in 2 years, 2019 to 21, they actually showed we can do this differently. We put our minds to it. We can actually build something amazing. And so Fedorov and Zelensky have the credibility to say to the swarm of brilliant Ukrainians across the world, come and help your country. And so, of course, you've got people being mobilized in the army, but also outside of the army, finding all sorts of ways to bring their tech skills to bear. So immediately there's this hacker army that goes after Russian websites and takes down services in Russia. But then a lot of that talent starts thinking, well, how can we put data, machine learning, and AI to use in the war effort? And so what we now see every day in the news is evidence of Ukraine really being the first military in the world to have made this leap into real 21st century warfare. So all the stuff that, you know, the American Naval War College and so on authors have been writing about for decades has now transpired, where, okay, the javelins were nice. That was sort of old school tech, but now drones built largely out of commercial tech, although now sort of developed beyond that, can take out tanks, can take out aircraft, and it's completely changed the economic calculus of warfare. It has given Ukraine temporarily a real leg up, But I say temporarily because if it is the case that Ukraine is today the best army in Europe, the best army in Russia, certainly the best army in Ukraine, then the second best is the Russian army. And Russia has been participating in this incredible defense technology accelerator courtesy of the Ukrainian army. So I mean, we can't be complacent about this at all, because what we see in the history of warfare is that warfare has this tendency to really focus minds, and it's a zero-sum game. You throw all your resources at it because the question is, can we beat the other guy? And so, in the same way, in a way that sort of maybe parallels a little bit the story of how in the 60s and 70s, the challenges of the Cold War really created this focus on performance and delivery and capabilities that pushed on Silicon Valley. We see that happening now in Ukraine in the war against Russia, which clearly is evidence of Ukraine having sort of built up these incredible societal capabilities. But what that means for humanity in general, I'm not sure it's so positive.
Absolutely. And the reasons for having such a urgency in having a significant change and everything like this. But at the same time, it is kind of interesting to see how they're not only tackling the digitalization part of it, they're making certain efficiencies, but actually responding to the really big questions. And one of the things that I saw a couple of weeks ago, I was at the Defense Tech meetup, and the discussion about how they actually completely restructured procurement, using digital tools, but actually looking at the entire process to make sure that the necessary equipment gets to the front line the fastest as possible.
Yeah, I mean, we could rabbit hole defense procurement, but let me make a big pitch first of all to the world, which is, because we'll get into the dangers of AGI later, and everyone worried about robotics and all of this. If anyone thinks, what's going on with AI and robotics and warfare in Ukraine is bad, the day we end the war, the innovation will slow down and there's going to be less terrible Terminator-like innovation coming out of there. So, dear West, collectively, if we given Ukraine the equipment and the funding it needed in 2022 to end the war, then we'd have a whole lot less killer robots than we have today. And every day that the Ukraine war drags on means more killer robots. And Ukrainians would like nothing more than to have the resources to decisively end this quickly.
Great. Well, not great. That's a response to this, but actually, moving forward, you're actually very correct that we could spend hours and hours discussing now the different perspective. But I think there was a good framing, and as part of it, another layer of framing, I would like to have a discussion about where we are in the technology world right now, where we are with AI, where we are with AGI, and things of that nature. I tend to be quite optimistic and quite a big proponent in saying that for all intents and purposes, for most of the humanity, the AGI is here, and the tools that we can use today, are bypassing what the human capabilities and all of this. Of course, there are much more detailed and technical definitions that say that it's maybe 5 years away, maybe 10 years away. Some people saying that maybe never. But I did want to ask your opinion on where we are and how far we are and what it takes us for us to get there.
Yeah. So, I mean, where to start? I don't know if this whole construct around AGI is constructive. We have to disambiguate things a little bit, because I think if the question we ask is, do we have machines that today can do cognitive work that are as good as or better than human efforts in many areas? The answer is yes. Mind you, the answer was also yes in 1960, right? It's just what's happened is that the scope or the kind of percentage of human cognitive work that machines can perform better has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And maybe we're now going through a sort of non-linear jump in that, because we had a whole bunch of assumptions about the types of cognitive work that machines couldn't do that held till maybe 2021 or 2022. And now suddenly we all have these free or almost free tools that we all can use as consumers that do that work. So first of all, if we ask just sort of before we get into the good or the bad and what does it mean society, where are we right now? I mean, I'm not a deep expert on the technology. I'm not building this stuff for the labs, but what I sort of gather from talking to and listening to the people who are is that let's see where we're not there yet, right? Let's start with that. Within the sort of world of agents and LLMs, One of the sort of most interesting metrics that I've kind of heard for assessing how good the intelligence is how long, if you give it a task, how long can you leave it unattended before it requires human intervention again? And if we go back to even a couple of years ago, you were as far away as it took one prompt to like return an answer, right? So you were a single shot against the language model. Now with the sort of thinking models, quote unquote, which is really just running the LLMs on themselves, a whole bunch of iterations, and then coming up with some interesting programming pipelines. It seems that for certain use cases like computer use, we've been able to push that window out to a few hours, basically where you can productively give a computer use program or an LLM that does programming and maybe one that does computer use a task for some minutes to hours before you really have to intervene. That's better than some humans, but still, less than what we expect today from people. And then the interesting question becomes, is there a wall that you're going to hit before that gets to a day, a week, a month? At which point I'd say, how many people do we know who can work independently without having their manager intervene once a week or a month, or not? I think I do sort of fall into the category that probably there's some more breakthroughs that are needed to really get to the sort of it can do all elements of human cognition moment. And Jan LeCun has talked a lot about world models. To break that abstraction down in a really simple way for the listener, basically everything we have now has been trained on text data. And all the reinforcement learning has also been done on either text data, programming, or mathematical computation. But there's a whole bunch of things we all do in the real world that are not encapsulated in text data, right? And there's a whole bunch of reinforcement learning, so when you actually train something to optimize, where we're like, we haven't set up the data pipelines to actually give it useful machine level feedback. So let's say you want to have an AI that can do effective economic policy. The question is your data on how the choices are impacting the outcomes that the machine is going to learn from, are they rich enough and good enough and specific enough that it can actually learn what works and what doesn't? Maybe for economic policy it can, but what about warfare? What kind of data do you need for that? Do you need to feed in all the sensor data from the battlefield in Ukraine, or maybe you need to feed it in all the geopolitics textbooks, but maybe something's missing there. So we're going to we're running into this moment now where the building blocks are there to really have the AGI, as it were, but some stuff still has to get put together. And then the question is that a couple of years or is it further? And the only counterpoint I would make to the argument that we're almost there is that when you automate something, you always, so far, have always discovered new layers of complexity that you just didn't know were there before, right? Mm-hmm. So when you automate a factory, you have to formally define all the different steps in what you're automating. So you go from, making a nail being something very artisanal, where every craftsman has their own way of doing it, you have to standardize it, right? And when you automate a knowledge process, you also realize that if you haven't formally defined the input data, the output data, what you're optimizing, it just falls apart. Mm-hmm. And so what we're discovering now is and we've been discovering this since the term AI was coined in the 50s, because there was the expectation in the 1950s that in 10 or 20 years, we'd have human-like intelligences, that there's always another layer there. And the question is, does that recursion go on forever, or do we get to an asymptotic point where actually we've thrown enough compute at it, we've put enough energy into it that we've now actually got there? And I don't know. But then we get to the next set of questions, which is, let's say we do get there, is that a good or a bad thing? Mm-hmm. And that, of course, is what
before we get there, I do have a couple of questions in the way. I have to say, my perspective is that I keep having those kind of whiplash moments as I'm focusing quite a bit on the AGI topics and advising organizations and the leaderships on how to be ready for the AGI era. And in one hand, I'm very closely following the technological developments, technological advancements. And from that standpoint, the rate of change is just massive. And you see the exponential changes and even the complexities that come out, and you see the different news articles coming out that, this is not working yet, or this LLM is not that capable yet, or something like this. But when you look at the overall picture, it is amazing at the speed and the rate the expansion is taking place. Mm-hmm. And not only, LLM, the advancement, things like this, but in overall the advancement of science. Mm-hmm. So that makes me very optimistic. And that also makes me say that, people, you need to understand and have the readiness to understand and accept that we actually do have an intelligence that's, bypassing our capabilities, that's joining the conversation. as a minimum. So this is kind of the interesting perspective. On the other hand, the human readiness to accept it and kind of understand it, what is really coming and how it's working. And for me, in many discussions, I'm actually saying that when we're talking about AI, we're talking technology. When we're talking AGI, we're talking about a new intelligence that's joining the conversation, that can be a good partner for us. And how do we actually utilize, how do we integrate it into organizations and things like this? Which kind of brings us to the next topic now. And this one, that I really want to have your perspectives, because you just actually came out with partners and Berlin with the white paper on the agentic the governance. And can you give a bit of a background over there about that and what the steps are to get there? And let's see where the conversation takes us.
Sure. So let me tell you about the white paper. So I just published a white paper on the agentic state, and it's about how AI agents and AI more generally could transform the functional layers of government. My co-authors were the Estonian chief AI officer at Velsberg, a good friend of mine from the World Bank, Thiago Peixoto. I know that I screwed up his name. I'm sorry, Thiago, when you hear this. And Manuel Kilian, who runs the Global GovTech Center of Excellence in Berlin. And what we tried to do in the paper is move away purely from the tech and say, given that we now have, as you say, this phenomenon of a new intelligence entering the room, and we have these capabilities in the form of AI agents that maybe are not yet fully in production, they're not yet reliable to put into every use case, but they're there and we can see where it's going. How does that change the business functions, the underlying sort of actual work of government? And we look at it in a functional way. So we look at, government in terms of the user interaction in the front office, the back office, how governments deal with crises, how they do things like develop their own people, do procurement. And the goal really is to have a more structured approach than just asking, well, okay, let's do another hype piece on the AI is going to change everything. There's no one single takeaway. I think the big macro takeaway is that if we assume that the modern bureaucratic state was really a function of the technology and the information processing of the 19th century and the early 20th century, the Weberian state and so on, then we're going to have a similar and I think far more profound transformation of government and governance arising from AI than we did in the 90s and the 2000s from digital technology and the web. And then, of course, we go into the details. So, for instance, on the level of user experience, what happens when the way you consume services, public or private, is with an AI agent instead of you actually going straight to the service provider? Some things that have been really hard for us to do in digital government, like actually have user-centered services or just build a good user interface, those might go away as problems because I don't have to worry about the user interface quality if I've got my agent maybe provided by Apple or Microsoft, maybe by someone else on my phone. It's already solved the UI for me. And the form's poorly designed, the whatever the UX isn't good, that's fine. It will navigate around that. But then how do you as a government meet that, provide useful resources to make that work well, make sure that you don't have equity issues? Or procurement. I think procurement's really interesting on two fronts. One is using AI for procurement. And we have this great company in Estonia, Pactum, that does, right now they focus on enterprise, but that does, sets up an environment for to have agents negotiating on behalf of both parties in the procurement. Well, public procurement is one of the big obstacles to any kind of innovation in government and just frankly, often to getting things done. If we can put the agents into that environment, we could just solve a lot of that brain damage. But I think even more profoundly, what you now see is tech companies are starting to offer outcomes instead of just services. You pay for the outcome of an agent doing a work, similar to how you might subcontract a human. Mm-hmm. The early examples are still fairly outcomes are technical, like Salesforce, instead of selling you a bunch of licenses for people with, operating a system, will sell you successful conversations. So every successful customer conversation using their platform, they'll bill you a few dollars. And then you go to the next step, which is actually start selling the actual outcomes. A successful registration of a business that's compliant with all the rules and doesn't lead to fraud down the road. Maybe you pay some company with an agentic framework to do that, either as a government or the business, instead of the usual provision model. So there's a whole bunch of changes to how the nuts and bolts of government work. And then we get into the broader questions of what does that mean for how we regulate, for how our laws work, how democracy works. Paper doesn't solve all this. I mean, our goal with the paper is really to start a conversation, on the one hand with the governments of the world, and on the other hand with the tech providers of the world. And underlying this is a realization that in the past few decades, government's not been very good at technology. And we talk a lot about Estonia and how good Estonia has been. Let's be very clear. We have been very good in comparison to other governments. But when people would ask me, well, how does Estonia stack up? I'd say that we beat most of the governments in the world, still do. But compared to your average Fortune 500 company, we're kind of average, middle of the road. And that's because governments just haven't been very good at procuring technology, building up the competence in-house, doing disruptive things with it. And my worry is if that pattern repeats itself now, then for all the sort of bloviating about what, AI governance on the level of how do we regulate the AI, how do we deal with the risks of AGI, if we simply have the part of our societies that we've tasked with standing up for the public interest and being the insurer of last resort and dealing with our defense, just incapable of using the technology and 5 to 10 years behind other actors that can include private sector in your country, that can include dangerous non-state actors, that can include your military adversaries, like you won't have the luxury of discussing how to regulate it. And so I think really the challenge today for government is a much more fundamental capacity building question. And I think given the speed of movement, it's become more urgent. So the paper, we hope, triggers a little bit of this. We're pushing people in government to think about the sort of 5 to 10 year perspective, not because we don't want them to iterate quickly and move today, but because they should do that with an energy and a sense of what's at stake that really brings enough resources to move quickly.
Okay. Based on your experience as a CEO of Estonia, and now having done all the work with the paper and things like this, one thought that I've had in my mind lately is kind of like it's interesting to see where this next true wave of advancement and innovation really will come, and how much we are actually in Estonia kind of a legacy solutions and the legacy in the way of our thinking as well, and not at all in a bad way, because as a citizen, as a business owner, I'm actually quite satisfied with the services that I'm getting and the level of and the ease of getting those services. But I'm actually curious to see that which government or which country will come next that will come in from kind of a similar position that Estonia was in the beginning of the 90s, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I'll start with an anecdote, and then I'll try and do a bit of an assessment of Estonia. So the anecdote, this was early 2024. So last year, we had a visit from the vice president of Ghana, Estonia, and he brought with him his digital minister, head of the digital agency, a bunch of his basically government tech community. And we had a sort of an hour-long meeting, and we were just talking about what we're doing, what they're doing. It just became so clear to me over the course of the conversation that they were, in every sense, technically, architecturally, their sort of ambition at the exact same level that we were at. And I asked at some point, so, who do you rely on then technologically, to push these things? The Americans, the Chinese, the Europeans? And his answer was, of course we have all those providers in, but for the really cutting edge stuff, we do it ourselves. Mm-hmm. We have enough talent in our universities, enough companies built here, et cetera, that we can contract our guys to do it, and they do it faster and cheaper. And that doesn't mean that Ghana, as Estonia, doesn't have a skills gap and doesn't have massive issues in building up its workforce, including of advanced AI engineers. But it speaks to the point that there's no monopoly today of needing to be a rich country or having a history in tech to be fast moving, as there wasn't in the 90s. So I think there will be countries like Ghana that do that same leapfrogging that we did in the 90s. That said, the legacy we have does provide us a whole bunch of advantages. And let me just sort of go through some of them. I mean, first of all, there's the foundation of the data. In our case, is sort of in fairly good shape, fairly well sanitized. Now, I think the issue for us in data and government has been that we have a lot of very well-organized small data, not necessarily sort of the big data to train the LLMs. But if we're talking about an automation pipeline, then we've got the governance and the accuracy of data that we can actually do automations or actually build automations on top of the automations we've done much more reliably and more quickly than a lot of places. And because we've also spent 20 years sort of building the administrative support to this, building the ideology, making a lot of leaders outside of technology and government aware of how to manage tech and work with tech, that does give us a leg up. So I think the countries that have been good at tech and government for the last couple of decades potentially are in a very good starting position. But they run the complacency risk and they have the innovator's dilemma, which is the platforms they built are pretty good. And so, is Estonia moving fast in tokenization and self-sovereign identity? No, because we have an identity infrastructure that's incredibly good for at least at the level of there being a live person using that identity in a process. Now, is that going to bite us in the behind if 2 or 3 years from now, tokenized payment and transaction rails allow the AIs to just start doing everything at 100x the speed? Maybe. So I think that's what we have to figure out. I think in the short term, I'm not, I don't know that Estonia will be number one in the world. Maybe that's Ukraine, maybe that's someone else. I think that specifically in public sector tech adoption, we're not going to sort of fall out of the top league too quickly because we're also not standing in place. And there's a lot of work that Estonians are doing here. But I think that there are going to be some surprise new entrants. And I think for me, the most interesting category of countries to look at is the Gulf states, besides Ukraine, of course. And the reason interesting is, look, they started thinking very hard about tech and government and governance sort of in the early 2000s. And there are a bunch of Estonian tech companies that have gone and built systems there. And I will admit, a decade or a decade and a half ago when I looked at that, feeling like wondering whether this was a sincere commitment or this was about reputation washing and they just wanted to have some bells and whistles to show they were doing something other than just oil. I think today it's very clear that what's going on there is very serious. The amount of talent they've got, the amount of their capital, which while plentiful is not endless that they're putting into this. Certainly the UAE, potentially also a few other states in the Gulf really have the ambition to be the fastest mover. And to be the fastest mover is at a whole bunch of different levels of the stack. I think Estonia has the ambition to be a fastest mover when it comes to adoption. So that's true in government, that's true in education, that's true in some sectors. They also want to be really big players at the infrastructure layer, the basic science layer. And we look at the volume of patents coming out of the UAE today, the quality of the infrastructure. Who knows how it's going to go, but they certainly have that potential.
Absolutely. One thing that I would add from Estonian standpoint still also is that I keep bringing out is that, we are very good implementers and we've been very good implementers. We've also been very good at executing large-scale projects and actually impacting significant change beyond digital technology. And this, the topics in the governance, the way we actually kind of run the country and execute the government services and the changes that have been made, have been quite significant, having all the services available online, etc.
Well, not just online. I think because we got to the point of having pretty much everything online more than a decade ago. What we've really been working on Estonia is a broader transformation of the government work based on what the technology allows, right? Yes. So process redesign, bringing this sort of user-centric thinking into the decision-making, into the planning of services, having your budgeting, your state budgeting, your strategic planning, take advantage of the data that you have and so on. And I wouldn't say that we've done that all perfectly, but I think if today you look at the broader measures of public sector performance, Estonia has one of the best performing public sectors in the world. That's not just a tech story, of course. You look at a couple of examples. It's hard to do these comparisons because there's not a single metric of how efficient a government is, but everyone's been thinking about government efficiency with Doge, right? Where we can measure things like the percentage of GDP that goes to the cost of collecting taxes, or the amount of healthcare spend that goes to administrative costs. Estonia is not 20 or 30% more efficient than the US or Germany. It is 3 or 4 times more efficient. And that's a reflection of a lot of fundamental reengineering. And interestingly enough, sometimes it's the efficiencies don't just come from the tech, but the tech actually triggers a conversation. Because if you go in and you say, I want to reform an institution, there's 2 problems. That one, it's threatening to everyone that you're going into reform. 2, Voters don't understand that. I mean, it's like the driest, most boring thing. Whereas if you say, I'm going to go and fix this up with tech, first of all the people who are part of the broken institution, they may not see the threat right away. They kind of go along with it, and either at some point their own thinking changes or they get sidelined. Also, it's from a psychological perspective, it's less threatening to say to someone, you're going to have to do things differently because the technology is changing, than to say, you've been doing a shitty job and you've governed this area poorly and now you need to change all your governance. So it's paradoxical. People always worry about are people going to resist the tech? And I would say that if we look at fixing institutions, tech actually makes it easier to go in and have these conversations. And we look at a lot of the successful governance reforms across the world, and that's often how it's come in. We go back to Ukraine, right? I mean, they come in talking about tech, but it's triggered a lot of other governance reforms, changing how services get designed, and so on and so forth. A lot of other European countries, Greece, you had a government that came in, I think in 2019, with a program called Greece 2.0. And initially they came in, they fixed some of the texting, they digital ID, interoperability, fixed services, but that became an engine to fix how the administrative state works in Greece and how they're accountable to citizens more generally. Whereas if they'd gone in and said, we're going to make the state more accountable and we're going to break all the institutions would have fought back and the voters would have gotten bored. So that's what we've been good at, right? The challenge again to us is, will we leverage AI in the same way? So I think there's some positive early signs Estonia is doing that. I mean, the first thing is if we just look at the willingness to do AI in the public sector, the thing that Estonians that the Estonian AI team hears consistently is everyone wants to do it. I mean, it's a very positive predisposition within the administration. Second of all, we look at the Tiger Leap too, the AI leap, this idea that we would universalize AI in secondary education. So far, a fairly positive reception. Of course, we're starting in earnest in September. So there's a lot of indications that we might repeat that in Estonia, but it's going to require a couple of years of diligent execution. And I think we have to do it artificially because we don't have an external stimulus. In the 90s, external stimulus was, we really want to be a developed, wealthy country and outside of the orbit of Russia, and it still is a risk, but it's less of a pressing need.
I always bring out also the aspect that being in European Union, we're also part of the kind of governance and I don't want to say adult in the room, the view of the topics, but with AI Act and taking this kind of a mature view of trying to legislate and control where we're going and have an impact on that. Any thoughts on this?
Well, yes. I don't want to start off by whining and complaining. Let's take the AI Act and GDPR put together. If you look at what these legislations want you to do, not in terms of what you have to do to comply, but actually what's the underlying behavior they want to bring about in market actors, most companies you speak to say this is all very reasonable. So what is the, GDPR says, okay, you've got data subject rights, there's responsible behavior, you should do the following things. You talk to most companies like, okay, yep, that makes sense, I should do that. AI Act, what's it mostly say? It says do some risk assessments, document your procedures, have some safeguards in place if you have a high-risk model. Yep, that makes sense. We want our companies to do that. The companies, of course, we should do that. Where things get tricky is when you get to the actual legal effectuation of, well, what are the thresholds? What constitutes high risk? What documentation do you have to have? How do you have to comply? And so why everyone complains about the GDPR and now about the AI Act is about the administrative burden and the uncertainty. And let's unpack those two separately, although they are related to each other. So the uncertainty bit is that these legislative acts are actually very vague in general in their wording. The part of what you should do, it's basically a couple dozen pages in both cases, which doesn't translate to very neatly or simply to the specifics of any particular situation. That's fine. That's normal in government. That the government issues a law and then the details become clearer through further implementing acts or through case law. Happens in the US too all the time. But the nuance is, of course, in Europe, we don't have one entity making those determinations. For data protection, we have 42 different data protection authorities. With AI, many countries have now multiple regulators for the AI Act. And the jurisdictional question, especially for the AI Act, is that any one of those authorities anywhere in Europe can instigate an investigation. So the legal compliance risk goes through the roof combined, of course, with fines that can be several percentages of global revenue. And then what do? You bring in the lawyers. And you say to the lawyers, okay, what are my risks? And the lawyers, being diligent doing their job, they will be very creative and identify all the ways in which you might not be compliant if you do something. And there's a difference in legal cultures, like it's worse in Germany than it is in Estonia, but those are really within the same band of smart people looking at the law and saying, well, it's ambiguous. And so you end up putting a huge amount of effort into limiting the compliance and legal risk that isn't going into either the product innovation or necessarily even thinking, well, what's actually best for my customer or my user? And so we've not because the governance and the regulations are unnecessary or the risks aren't there, but because of the governance set up of how Europe works, we really all walked ourselves into a really suboptimal situation. I don't think anyone's happy, other than, again, maybe some of the compliance and legal people who get to write really big bills. And data protection lawyers are quite employable. But like, it's not a question of Europe regulating too much because it's too afraid of technology, but really just hasn't figured out the matrix of how to make the regulation work. And it's funny, there are areas where it does work in Europe. So aviation safety, famously, Europe's done a pretty good job. And that's in part because there's one decider in Europe. There's the European Aviation Safety Authority. Effectively, all the national aviation safety authorities are branch offices of EASA. It's a slight exaggeration. And they can be very strict. They can be very technical. Sometimes they have more onerous requirements than the FAA. But when we see what's happened with Boeing in the last couple of years, maybe that's not a bad thing. So it's not that strict requirements are bad per se, but there's also clarity and certainty. There's one EASA and one set of requirements. And that creates a miracle that you can get on a Wizz or a Ryanair flight and not worry about the safety any more than you do for a Lufthansa flight. Mm-hmm. So I don't think regulations and rules aren't bad, but they have to work quickly and reactively and in a clear way that moves at the speed of the tech. And the governance we have in Europe does not move at the speed of the technology right now. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This is one thing that I've kind of keep pondering as well, that even in the past, it takes time to pass regulation, it takes time to implement regulation, things like this. With AI, AGI, the topic itself moving so fast and the different advancement in so many different fields that it's affecting, just to keep up, to even creating those regulations, even less than implementing them, having them roll out through that.
One of the I think more provocative ideas in this paper on the agentic state is that the layer of how states create legislation, regulatory rules, could also be agentified. Mm-hmm. Maybe not sort of the types of law that apply to physical people. So the rules that can't say what is a murder and what's your free speech. Let's leave those alone. But a huge amount of our regulation is really the state applying limitations on enterprises. And there's usually some kind of abstract, hopefully empirical calculation of public interest there. So we have rules on pollution. We're trying to keep our CO2 levels and other harmful chemicals under a certain level. That's an empirical question. What works? Mm-hmm. What keeps those levels under a certain level, right? Or cybersecurity legislation. What works? What motivates companies to take the right measures? And we can go through a lot of areas. Well, why do we have to write and amend those speeds at human speed? Well, primarily because we also need humans to be able to read them. What if the companies have agents too? So we could imagine a situation where agents whose mandate is a public interest or some aspect of that negotiate with agents mandated to, speak on behalf of the regulated enterprises, and they find an equilibrium or an optimum that is, first of all, more efficient, that is perhaps more dynamic than the current optimum. So I could easily imagine a situation where the best sort of machines or the best minds to be regulating the AI are AIs. Now, there's a whole lot of very difficult conversations on mechanism design, right? Because this is not a novel idea. You've got people talking about how AIs are going to be useful for creating AI transparency because they can actually test the AIs and do penetration testing and so on. And that the only thing that we can really do to slow down the disaster scenarios on AGI is to have AIs aligned with our interests. So that's not a novel idea. You don't see that really in practice yet. And there are engineering difficulties there are institutional design difficulties, but I think that's where we might find ourselves ending up at. If things don't blow up first, is that a lot of the work the sort of boring, diligent work of preparing regulations and then checking compliance is going to be done by agents. And that's not a bad thing inherently. I mean, we can get a lot of people in this room to talk about all the risks and all the ways it could go wrong, but it could also go very right. And that's, of course, the broader point with everything on AI, right? Is that we can imagine a lot of ways it goes very wrong, but we can also imagine ways that this goes incredibly right.
Yes. There's definitely a dystopian and utopian view of the developments. I tend to like the positive side and then focus on the positive side, partially because I think there are plenty of people in the world focusing on the negative and being afraid of the risk. I think the optimists need their voice and need their part as well.
Especially in government. I mean, this is, you ask emotionally why I put effort into this paper on agents in government, and why I think this is a really important purpose to work on is, especially in government, there are so many voices that will tell us about all the risks, that will slow things down, and we do need to sort of counterbalance that. That said, I mean, I think we can have a conversation on, well, how do we do that in an intelligent way? I think one of the things we need to adjust is this question of where is the locus of control, where we actually apply a lot of our brakes or our sort of where we slow things down because of ethics or rights concerns, and we've mislocated that locus of control in a lot of processes. So, and I can illustrate this with two examples, a negative and a positive example. So the negative example is the current AI technology, but some years ago, the NHS in the UK said, well, let's use algorithms to rank organ donor recipients. Because, anyways, has to be ranking, let's do it algorithmically. They made a really bad mistake in the algorithm design. Because they said, okay, what we want to do is we want to optimize for number of predicted additional years of life that come from the kidney transplant, right? And so the people who are going to gain more years of life, we're going to prioritize them. There's a logic to that. There's a philosophical conversation. We'll put that aside as to whether that's the best optimization. But they cut the calculation off at 5 years. And so, which meant that the maximum score you get was 5 years of life. So what happens is really healthy older people max out on the score. And if you're younger and you need a kidney transplant, you may be a more complicated case. But younger people were the upside. If the transplant successful, might be 30, 40, 50 years of life. Because it topped out at 5 years expected gain, we're getting ranked lower. And so the effect was that for many, many years, basically almost no one in the UK who was young got a kidney transplant. Now, the question is, where did the fatal error happen? And a lot of people are going to say, well, my God, they made the choice to use algorithms, how bad? And I'm saying, no. They made choice to use algorithms and they made a mistake in the algorithmic design. That's completely normal. Make mistakes in algorithm design all the time. It's a learning process. But what happened then was, first of all, they put that into practice, ignoring all the people who gave them feedback saying it's a bad idea. And then they kept on using this for 5 years as they got complaints about it, right? So like if they made a bad design, said, we're considering this design, and then they'd stopped and they'd fixed the design, it would have been much better, right? And so the countervailing positive cases, we started using in Estonia some plagiarism detection software to identify when LLMs had been used. And we had this last year one false positive, where someone who hadn't used them was identified to have used LLMs by the software, and they had their test results initially marked at 0. We said, wait a minute, like this is a travesty, like this person didn't cheat. And then they said, pause, we're of course going to rectify the situation for this one person, then we're going to investigate what went on, and then keep on using the tool once they figured it out. So the point is, using algorithms is very good, but you have to have a very sensitive and quick feedback loop to detect when there has been some kind of miscarriage of that process, and also make right the people who've been the victims of that miscarriage. And if you do that, then you can actually move quickly and use this stuff. And the sort of the wrong lesson would be to say, well, it makes mistakes, so we're not going to use it. And I think this is sort of a point where like we've put a lot of the controls early on in the pipeline to not let this process make mistakes, instead of asking what are the consequences of the mistakes. That's the same thing in data protection. Right? We have all these rules around who can access the data that apply the controls at the point of initial access, as opposed to applying the controls at the point of what are the consequences of that data being used for a decision or fed into some kind of a process. I think we have to rethink those things, and the ultima ratio, this is what we should come back to, is the first principle of asking, well, what are the deep underlying human values that we want these systems to be supporting, and then ask, are our current laws and institutions actually supporting them? And I think if we ask that question, what we'll run into is a lot of the institutions we've designed and the rules we've designed, they need to be tweaked and they need to be redone. And there's a balance. You don't want to be nihilistic about it, because then you'll just wipe away a lot of good work. But we have to be open to the idea that, as in the 19th and 20th century with the Industrial Revolution, we had to redesign our institutions to achieve, and promote dignity, equity, et cetera. We're going to probably have to do that again.
I would even say not only probably. This will need to happen. One of my reflections when I was reading your paper was that it was actually interesting to see that much of the discussion about the digital governance and different steps, and even what the Estonian and other advanced societies have done, it's still kind of making the previous system more efficient. When I was reading the paper, I was like, really the agentic governance, the real-time governance, the really having the engagement with the different aspect that brings, that actually will bring quite a significant revolution in the societal structures and the governance models and everything like this. So this is something that is quite interesting. Yeah. Now, to be a bit practical, though, in this conversation, and as kind of one of the goals of the podcast is to kind of share the experiences that we've had and share our thinking, the kind of news in the world in the AGI and the governance and different topics as well. But maybe some practical thoughts, for the governments who are kind of in the beginning of still trying to go from the paper-based processes to the digital processes, the governments who are kind of halfway through that process, and also for the advanced nations. What should they maybe pay more attention to, or where it would make sense to make some significant changes in the approach?
Mm-hmm. Look, I mean, the first practical recommendation that everyone makes, but it bears repeating, is in this particular moment, just start using the tools. As an individual, as an organization, just get your hands dirty. The skills barrier to employing these tools has never been lower, and there may be processes you don't want to put Gen AI or Agentic AI into right away, but play with the low-risk processes, see what you can do. And right now, most of these tools are fairly affordable. They are easy to use. Next question is you have to come up with some sort of internal sense of which are the areas where the new technological capabilities change the game and where they don't. So, I mean, there's some systems engineering jobs and challenges that probably aren't going to change. But a lot of your data pipeline, I think a lot of the hard work Estonia has had to do to sort of clean up its data and tend it. I like to say it's a bit of a, we built this Japanese garden where we go and look at our databases and snip every leaf that's errant. Maybe you can do that a whole lot faster with Gen AI. In general, I think what will repeat itself is that enterprise moves faster. And so if you're looking for sources of inspiration, yes, of course, look at other governments, but primarily look at what in your country around you companies are doing. There will not be a country in the world where there aren't startups doing interesting things and where the large enterprises aren't already experimenting, doing interesting things. And that will be your source of talent, your source of ideas. It's perfectly fine from a public sector perspective to be a fast copier. Emphasis on the fast, right? You don't have to be the fastest mover, but you can't be the slowest mover either. And the last thing I would say is to maintain a fairly high level of ambition. Like, if you're asking what do we optimize and what does good look like, don't go for a 20, 30% improvement. Because if we already, prior to the arrival of Gen AI and AI agents, have by many metrics of quality and efficiency a 2, 3, 4x difference between the best performing and the sort of average performing governments, not even worse performing, then that should be your starting point. Like, you should come in and say, I want to be at least as good as Estonia and these efficiency gains, this transparency, et cetera, getting there faster because the cost of doing coding, the cost of transforming the data has gone lower. And then, of course, I want to surpass them. So really, like, the ambition is really important to frame the question. And that should give you the political will it's really important in the public sector to actually do the hard things. Because if we look at why public sectors in a lot of Western Europe, North America, other places haven't done this, at the end of the day, it's not for lack of talent. It's not even for lack of knowledge. I've been able to sit down with very smart people in countries in Europe that haven't done these transformations. They know what they need to do, but their legislative changes, their funding challenges, their institutional challenges they haven't overcome. The one thing that sort of these success cases can give you and that the hype can give you is maybe that's enough to assemble the political will and the coalitions to push through these changes that you need to do.
And the cultural challenges and the trust challenges and things like this. And we've been very fortunate here in Estonia that we have this very engineering mindset, and we're very quick to actually accept and like the change and innovation and those things. So these are definitely the kind of interesting aspects going ahead. Now, when you're looking at the developments really from the technology side, which are the items that are kind of that you're viewing with the caution, or you're kind of keeping your eye on? For me, it's actually interesting right now to see the continued statistics on the hallucinations of the LLMs, and kind of having the balance between the hype and what is really possible and what the real advancement and what are those advancements are. What are the aspects from your side?
Yeah, I mean, I think you framed it right, which is that the question for a lot of the automation today is how performant does it have to be to actually rely on it in a lot of automation use cases? And the common sense sort of mental heuristics of what a percentage means may not be very useful. Like if you like get told that that like an LLM has an error rate of 90 or is correct 99.99% of the time means per instance, per API call, whatever. Well, these things compound, right? So if you have a system that only gives out the root password for the admin rights once per million interactions, or once per million attempts to hack it, or do an injection attack, but there's 10 billion injection attacks per day, it's going to give root access out, right? So there is like the difficulty is at the systems engineering level of really using this in production. I mean, the good news is there's a lot of low enough risk use cases where that doesn't matter, right? First of all, anything where we still do keep a human in the loop is easy. Doing things like letting the LLMs basically prepare decisions, prepare transactions for us, and then lower risk automations. Why not? So I think, what do I keep an eye on? I 100% keep an eye on that same question. The other thing that I keep an eye on, which is less a function of the technology being immature, but who's, the potential adversarial use, is I think we're going to go, and I keep on predicting it's going to happen in the next 12 months. And I predicted that 12 months ago, so maybe this is taking a little longer than we thought. But we're going to go through a real shocking period in terms of identity theft, fraud, and cyber attacks. Because the bad actors are adopting these tools. The bottleneck for years has been talent and skills, right? Like, you can only conduct as many malicious cyber attacks as you had fairly capable people to carry them out. Well, that's no longer a bottleneck. And the sort of the remaining safeguards that societies and countries that didn't have secure electronic identity had to sort of catch fraud. If Mabel in Kansas wants to correct her social security statement, you can call her up, and if she sounds like Mabel in Kansas, that's a helpful indicator. You can do a video call, and if she looks like Mabel in Kansas, that's a helpful indicator. Well, that doesn't work anymore today, because some guy in random place in Russia or India who's a guy can sound and look like Mabel in Kansas, or it can just be a bot running it, right? So it's like a lot of the protective measures of how we do security, both the technical cybersecurity and the sort of the human level security around fraud and identity theft and so on, those don't protect us anymore. That bottleneck's gone. And I'm just waiting for that to get exploited massively, and that's going to trigger, I think, any country that hasn't figured out EID to do that very, very quickly. And it's going to have to change a lot of how we do cybersecurity. It's basically, I think on cybersecurity, the only thing that's going to work at scale is to massively be attacking our own infrastructure before the bad guys do. And so, I mean, that's sort of a trend that I'm keeping a lot, that I'd be focusing on right now. And beyond that, look, using the stuff that's fairly state of the art to see what it can do.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask the other side of the coin. What gets you most excited, and what are we looking forward to? From my side, it's actually the equal advancement, as I said earlier, the advancements in the LLM technologies and everything like this, and the useful that we can do with it. But it's also the advancements of science and the matters of extension of the life and the healthy life, the expectancy, the expectation that all of us may have a possibility to live to 120, 150, and much longer. And also many of the abundance topic. I'm an avid listener of Peter Diamandis' podcast, and every time I listen to it, I come back very, very optimistic and very positive about the abundance topics, and that there are technological solutions for many of the greatest ills and the risks that we have in the world. What gets you excited?
Well, I think that too. Maybe, on top of that, I'd also add robotics, where I think we're going to see a sort of 2022, 23 moment in robotics pretty soon, just where the level of capabilities are really impressive. That will, of course, get a lot of people worried about the future of work scared again, because the last fallback of the AI will take an output, much less yet at the kind of teams and organizational level. And that's because there's a collective learning process. And how do we actually, if we have another intelligence in the room, how do we work together with them at a team or organizational level? Probably fastest moving are going to be sort of born AI organizations, but everyone else is going to kind of have to catch up with that too. And then at the societal level, I mean, if we look at the huge variation, diffusion of technology in government, healthcare, and education today, then it's also very easy to imagine that large parts of our society and in many countries in the world are not going to take advantage of these tools for quite a while. So I think there's just with the tech we have today, how do we get it out there? How do we get rid of the bottlenecks? How do we help people learn how to use it?
Absolutely. And the question about actually integrating the usage of the tools into the organization and to all the layers, this is one of the topics that I'm really focusing on my kind of everyday life, where I'm really, telling the organization and supporting the organization how to harmonize the usage, to make sure that they have a common language, they have a common understanding that everybody's using, similar to the way to our education system, the AI leap.
Can I interview you then for a second? So if you look at the organizations you're working with, what kinds of organizations are doing a particularly good job? And maybe let me ask differently. Is the dimension of variation that is it something I'd expect, or is it surprising? Is there some X factor that makes some organizations really good at doing the changes they need to make, or is it sort of the obvious stuff you'd imagine in terms of, their openness to change and how well managed?
So far, I would say it's kind of obvious. The more the company is using AI itself for offering its services to building the products and things like this, the more knowledge they already have in-house, the more they also tend to use it for actually running the company and trust in running the company. Where it's less the case, the more kind of harmonization and understanding needs to take place. For many places, actually, the big surprise moment is actually when they do the first survey of how many people are using actually in everyday work, and what they're using and how they're using. And very often it's it's one department using more Claude, the other one using more ChatGPT, and what are the different use cases. And unfortunately, in many cases, it also comes out with how much data is actually flowing out of the organization already, and how to bring it in and harmonize. But the other level is how to bring it into the executive management, how to bring it into the boardroom, how to whether you go and give the board level vote. I don't know if you need to go that far yet, but actually into the conversation, to have an AI listen into the board meetings, not just transcribe and do short outtake, but actually be part of the conversation, providing feedback and things like this. And we've had quite a good discussion already. I promise that this podcast will be at least an hour.
You have some cutting to do.
We've gone past that. I'm not going to do any cutting. If we have a good conversation going, maybe 2 pieces I'll take out. But But I did want to get to an important question, which is, how about the super intelligence?
Mhm.
What are we going to do with that? I'm actually just joking, because I'm going to invite you back for that.
All right.
Because if we open that, it will be another hour.
Well, look, for those of you who are watching this on video, though, the deer in the headlights, I mean, I think it's a collective deer in the headlights. I don't think humanity knows. Yeah.
Yeah, this is something that, let's not even open this one right now. You have an open invitation to come back.
We may discover in a year or two we've been rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
I'm still keeping the more positive view that I think that we may look back and say that we were very naive and we were kind of using the old level of thinking. But I think actually the level of how much our own thinking and experience and power and intellect and intelligence is already improved in the last couple of years, that we've been kind of avid users, or at least I can speak for myself. I've been an avid user of ChatGPT and using it as a business partner and life coach and other topics. Of course, being a bit careful with the
Let me
dependency.
Let me use a better metaphor then, right? Maybe we've been debating the optimal color with which to paint the industrial machines.
Yes, I think that sounds good. And that sounds like a very good way to wrap up today's episode. I'm very happy that you came and became the first guest of the Estonian General Intelligence podcast. A wonderful conversation. As I said, you have an open invitation to come back and continue the conversation.
And if anyone's wondering what color to paint your industrial machines, the answer is blue, black, white, some more blue, and yellow.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.